Welcome to Turning Point. Tonight, we unravel a story so explosive, so quietly dangerous, that one single moment changed the lives of everyone involved. In 1847, inside a wealthy merchant's household, a forbidden spark flickered where it never should have, between the merchant's own son and the enslaved woman his father claimed as property. What began as a glance became a secret. What became a secret became a risk, and what became a risk turned into a reckless love that pushed them toward a fate no one could have predicted. This is the moment where their paths split, the moment everything shifted, the true turning point. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is, and don't forget to subscribe to Turning Point for more powerful stories that flip history on its head. The Harrington estate in 1847 stood as a monument to everything the South believed it represented: power, discipline, elegance, and absolute order. Visitors who approached the long, winding dirt road leading to the mansion often paused to take in the sight before them: tall white columns rising toward the sky, windows reflecting the sun like polished mirrors, and wide porches wrapped around the structure like the arms of a proud giant claiming its throne. It was not a home in the simple sense of the word. It was a declaration, one carved from wealth, labor, and the unspoken suffering of those who kept it running like a flawless machine behind the scenes. But inside those walls, beneath the polished wood and glittering chandeliers, cracks were forming long before anyone ever noticed. Charles Harrington, the man responsible for building this empire, believed fervently in rules. To him, rules were not merely guidelines, they were lifelines. A man without rules, he said, was a man standing on the edge of the world with nothing to hold on to. And so he built his life like a series of unbreakable chains: business first, family second, appearances always. People in town described him as fair but stern, generous but intimidating, and impossible to please unless you met his standards exactly. Still, nobody could deny that he had an iron grip on everything he owned, from the sprawling warehouses on the riverfront to the human lives working inside his home. Thomas Harrington, his only son, grew up watching this rigid world unfold around him. As the heir to the estate, Thomas had been trained from childhood to stand straight, speak politely, calculate profits, negotiate deals, and hide emotions behind a composed mask. While other children raced with bare feet through open fields or climbed trees with scraped knees and carefree laughter, Thomas was inside learning how to read account ledgers and studying maps of trade routes. Charles believed these lessons were the highest form of love he could offer, a foundation for the legacy Thomas would eventually inherit. But Thomas did not feel fortunate. In fact, he often felt trapped, not in the physical sense, but in a way far more suffocating. From the moment he woke up to the moment he went to bed, his life was choreographed. Breakfast at 6 sharp, study with a private tutor at 7, ride along with his father to observe business dealings at 9, etiquette lessons at noon, more studying in the afternoon, and evening discussions by the fireplace where Charles would test his son on everything he had learned that day. The mansion's grandeur meant nothing to Thomas. To him, it was a cage made of polished floors and perfectly aligned expectations. The only place he ever felt remotely free was in the far back of the estate, near the oak trees where the forest began. There, the air felt different, lighter. He used to sneak out during breaks to breathe, think, or simply exist without his father's vigilant gaze tracking his every movement. Yet even in these stolen moments, he never truly escaped the constant reminder of who he was supposed to be. The Harrington name followed him like a shadow. The household staff maintained the estate with silent precision. The enslaved workers, most of them born into the system, moved quietly through the halls, carrying trays, preparing meals, ironing clothes, tending to the grounds, and performing countless invisible tasks. They learned early on that invisibility was their shield. The less noticed you were, the safer your life remained. Thomas had been raised to view them as part of the environment, never to engage in conversations beyond instructions. Maintain distance, Charles always said. They respect you more when they fear disappointing you. But Thomas had never been comfortable with the hierarchy, even as a boy. Something about it gnawed at him. When he was younger, he had once given a young enslaved child a toy horse carved from wood. He remembered the bright spark in the child's eyes, pure joy, and how quickly it vanished when Charles snatched the toy away and sent the child to work in the fields as punishment for overstepping. That night, Thomas overheard his father telling one of the overseers, "If you let them think they are close to you, they will forget their place." Thomas didn't sleep that night. He never forgot the sound of the whip the next morning either. By the time Thomas turned 19 in 1847, he had learned to bury every instinct that made him question the world around him. He walked with straight shoulders, spoke with a calm voice, and pretended the order of things made sense. But deep within him, something restless lived, something that felt at odds with every rule his father carved into him. And then came Eliza. She arrived at the Harrington estate earlier that year, sent from a distant relative's property after a series of trades and business consolidations. Her presence didn't cause a ripple in the household. At first, slaves were transferred between plantations, often enough that new faces came and went without ceremony. But Eliza wasn't like the others, not in demeanor, not in presence, not in the quiet way she carried herself. She possessed a calm that drew the eye without meaning to, a grace that suggested something delicate yet unyielding lived within her. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and she moved with the fluidity of someone who knew that danger lived in every corner of her world. The first time Thomas saw her, she was cleaning the long hallway mirror at the base of the staircase. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, scattering soft gold across the polished floors. Eliza paused for a moment, perhaps lost in thought, and her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. Something about the image, her solemn expression, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the way she seemed almost weightless, felt out of place in a house built on cold precision. Thomas couldn't explain it, but he found himself lingering longer than he should have. He wasn't staring at her beauty alone, though she was undeniably beautiful. It was something else, something deep beneath the surface. An aura, a story, a silent spark that made her stand apart from the other enslaved workers who had long since learned to fold themselves inward. He quickly looked away before she could notice. That was the first rule he remembered: never draw unnecessary attention to them. But that small moment stayed with him longer than he liked to admit. Over the next few weeks, Eliza worked quietly and efficiently, assigned mostly to indoor tasks: laundry, cleaning, and serving guests during gatherings. Charles believed indoor slaves represented the face of the household, so he selected them carefully. Eliza fit his criteria without question: obedient, discreet, composed. But Thomas sensed more beneath the surface. Every time he caught a brief glimpse of her, passing in the hallway, arranging books in the library, carrying baskets across the courtyard, he felt that same inexplicable pull. He told himself it was nothing more than curiosity. After all, he barely knew her. They had spoken perhaps once, exchanging simple greetings, but curiosity often plants seeds that grow silently, slowly, and irreversibly. One evening in early spring, the mansion buzzed with activity in preparation for a gathering of businessmen and political figures. Charles believed in networking the way other men believed in religion, and these events were his sacred rituals. The house had to be flawless, every candle lit, every surface polished, every servant positioned perfectly. Thomas hated these nights. He hated the false smiles, the forced conversations, the way men talked loudly about profits while ignoring the people who made those profits possible. To escape the noise, he stepped out. To the side veranda where the night air offered a small breath of freedom. The sky was tinted with fading orange and soft purple, and fireflies flickered above the grass like sparks drifting from an unseen flame. Thomas leaned against the railing, letting the cool breeze settle his mind, and then he heard something, a voice, soft, delicate, almost mournful. Someone was humming a melody he didn't recognize, but the sound held so much emotion that it felt like a story woven into music. He followed the sound around the corner, past the veranda steps, toward the courtyard where lanterns cast faint circles of light on the stone path. There she was, Eliza, standing near the old stone well, her back turned to him, her head slightly bowed as she worked. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but it carried through the quiet like a fragile ribbon floating on the wind. The melody was sad, haunted, and somehow familiar in the way certain emotions are familiar even without memory. Thomas froze. He didn't want to interrupt her. He didn't even want to breathe too loudly. It felt like witnessing a moment he was never meant to see, something private, something born from a world he didn't understand. But Eliza, sensing movement behind her, stopped immediately. The humming ceased, and she straightened her posture, readying herself for reprimand. When she turned to face him, her eyes widened slightly. Not in fear, but in caution. "I'm sorry," Thomas said quickly, lifting a hand in a gesture of reassurance. "I didn't mean to startle you." His voice was gentle, softer than his father's, softer than any voice Eliza was accustomed to hearing from someone of his status. She lowered her gaze, uncertain how to respond. Slave etiquette dictated silence, distance, obedience. But this, an apology from the master's son, broke the expected order of things. "You didn't do anything wrong," Thomas added, noticing how tense she had become. "You don't have to be afraid." She remained quiet, though the stiffness in her shoulders eased slightly. The lantern light illuminated her face, revealing just how young she truly was. No older than Thomas, perhaps even younger. There was strength in her features, but also exhaustion, the kind worn by someone who had seen far more than her years should have allowed. Thomas didn't know why he felt compelled to stay, but he did. Something about the moment felt weighted, meaningful, like the first domino tipping in a line he didn't yet see. He thought of asking about the song, about where she learned it. But he knew any question might put her on edge, or get her in trouble if overheard. So he simply nodded, offered a small, genuine smile, a smile not of superiority but of shared existence, and stepped back. "Good night," he said softly. For a second she looked up just long enough to meet his eyes. It was brief, almost hesitant, but in that single glance something shifted, something delicate yet irreversible. Thomas didn't fully understand it then. She didn't either. But fate often begins quietly, with the softest moments, the smallest gestures, the simplest words. As he walked away, he felt a tug inside him that he couldn't explain. Something had changed, something had awakened, and somewhere deep in the quiet corners of the Harrington estate, where air carried the weight of secrets and lives intertwined by force rather than choice, the first spark of a forbidden story had just been lit. Thomas Harrington never forgot the night he heard Eliza's humming in the courtyard. In the days that followed, the sound replayed in his mind with a stubborn persistence he did not understand. It wasn't just the melody, it was the feeling it carried. A quiet kind of sorrow, as if the music had been stitched together from pieces of a life heavy with memories she could never voice aloud. He found himself listening for it in the evenings, wandering the edges of the courtyard when he should have been preparing account summaries for his father or reviewing inventory ledgers. But he never heard the tune again. Eliza, perhaps startled by the unexpected encounter, avoided humming in open spaces. She moved with even more caution than before, her steps careful, her eyes lowered, her presence quieter than a whisper. Thomas noticed, though he pretended not to. He forced himself to act normal, to follow the rigid routine his father demanded, but his mind drifted more often than he liked. He tried pushing away the thoughts, telling himself they were harmless, meaningless. But curiosity can be as relentless as a tide. It keeps coming back, wearing down every excuse put in its path. One afternoon, after a long morning spent reviewing shipment documents, Thomas stepped into the hallway to clear his mind. The air was warm and carried the faint scent of lavender from the gardens. As he approached the main staircase, he spotted a small commotion near the bottom. Nothing loud, but enough to catch his attention. An older enslaved woman was speaking in a stern whisper, her voice sharp with frustration. Eliza stood before her, head bowed, hands clasped tightly behind her back. A broken ceramic pitcher lay on the floor, shards glittering like tiny knives against the polished wood. The older woman sighed heavily and muttered, "You must be more careful, child. The master's temper is short these days. Eliza nodded, her voice too soft to hear as she offered an apology. Thomas paused on the stairs for a moment, watching the interaction with a tightness in his chest he didn't expect. He hated how fearful Eliza looked, not terrified, but bracing herself for a punishment she had learned to anticipate. Before the woman could speak again, Thomas descended the last few steps. "What happened?" he asked, keeping his tone calm. Both women froze. The older one immediately lowered her gaze. "My apologies, sir," she said. "It was just a small accident. It won't happen again." Thomas glanced at the pieces on the floor. He could see it was an honest mistake. The picture was old, probably cracked already. It looked like something that might have broken under the lightest pressure. "It's fine," he said gently. "I'll let my father know it wasn't anyone's fault." The older woman nodded gratefully, relieved, and hurried to fetch a broom. Eliza remained still, quiet, eyes fixed on the ground as if afraid to move without permission. Thomas hesitated. A dozen unspoken rules pressed against him, reminding him of the lines he was expected not to cross. But something inside him refused to let the moment pass. "It wasn't your fault," he said to her quietly. Eliza glanced up, but only for an instant. "Thank you, sir," she murmured. He wanted to say more, to ask if she was all right, to assure her she wasn't in danger, but footsteps approached from the dining room, and he stepped back quickly, pretending he had only been passing through. Eliza hurried after the older woman, leaving Thomas alone with the lingering sense that he had just done something dangerous, even if it seemed harmless on the surface. From that day on, he began noticing Eliza more often, not intentionally, at least not at first. She floated around the house like a soft shadow, always present but never intrusive. He watched her dusting shelves in the library, polishing silver in the dining room, carrying baskets of laundry across the hall. But what struck him most was her silence. She performed every task with the precision expected of her, but her movements carried a sadness he couldn't ignore. And yet every so often he caught glimpses of something else, moments where her guard slipped, a faint smile when another servant whispered a joke, a quick flash of amusement when a sudden summer breeze lifted the edge of a tablecloth she was trying to secure, a softness in her eyes when she passed the window that overlooked the fields, as though she were remembering something distant, something lost. Those fleeting pieces of her humanity startled Thomas. He had been taught his whole life to view slaves as labor, not people with dreams or inner worlds. But Eliza shattered that belief in silence, without effort, simply by being human in ways he had been conditioned not to notice. The turning point came on a particularly humid afternoon when Thomas escaped his father's office to take a walk through the gardens. He often sought refuge there. The flowers didn't judge him, the vines didn't question him, and the breeze didn't expect him to uphold the Harrington legacy. As he walked among the roses, he spotted Eliza near the water barrels, pulling down a heavy pail. The fabric of her dress clung to her back from the heat, and he could tell she was struggling with the weight. Before he could stop himself, he approached. "Let me help." Eliza gasped softly and nearly dropped the handle. "No, sir, please, I can manage." "You don't have to," he insisted. "It's too heavy for one person." She shook her head quickly, panic flickering in her eyes. "If someone sees you helping me—" Thomas understood. Appearances, always appearances. Even a simple act of kindness could be twisted into a scandal by the wrong witness. He looked around. No one was nearby. The air was still, heavy, silent. "Just step back," he said gently. "I'll lift it. You can carry the smaller bucket." Reluctantly, she nodded. Together they moved the water into the smaller containers, working quietly, efficiently. A few stray drops splashed onto his shirt, but he didn't care. Eliza seemed tense at first, but gradually the fear in her expression eased. When they finished, she whispered, "Thank you." Thomas felt something warm stir in his chest. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was concern, empathy, the kind of feeling he was rarely allowed to express. "You're welcome," he replied. "Really?" Eliza hesitated, then asked softly, "Why are you kind to me?" The question caught him off guard. He blinked, searching for an answer he didn't fully understand. "Because you deserve it," he said finally, The way she looked at him then, confused, touched, wary, felt like a small doorway had opened between them, one neither had intended to create. But everything changed on the night of the thunderstorm. The sky cracked open with lightning that shook the windows, and rain hammered the roof like fists demanding entry. It was late, far past the hour when the servants should have retired to their quarters, but the storm had caused the kitchen pantry to flood. Several enslaved workers rushed around trying to salvage the supplies, gathering sacks of flour and crates of vegetables before the rising water ruined everything. Thomas, unable to sleep, wandered down to help. He claimed curiosity, but the truth was that storms always unsettled him. They reminded him of arguments between his parents when he was young, sharp, loud, unpredictable. He entered the pantry quietly, ready to lend a hand, but froze when he saw Eliza struggling to drag a heavy crate to higher ground. Her dress was soaked from the waist down, clinging to her legs like a second skin. Strands of hair escaped her braid, sticking to her face. The lantern beside her flickered wildly, throwing shifting shadows across the room. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Eliza, let me take that." She startled again. "Sir, you shouldn't be here. Your father—" "I don't care what my father thinks right now," Thomas said, grabbing the crate from her. "You'll hurt yourself." She looked torn between relief and fear. The storm raged outside, shaking the walls. Thunder boomed so loudly it drowned out everything except the pounding of their hearts. They worked side by side, moving crates, securing shelves, and pushing water away from the remaining supplies. The air was thick with heat and tension, the lantern casting warm light over their faces. Every time their hands brushed, a jolt ran through Thomas like a spark leaping from hidden wires. Eliza flinched each time, not because she recoiled from him, but because she didn't know how to navigate a world where someone like him could show her gentleness. When the last crate was lifted to safety, Eliza leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Rain drummed outside in relentless waves. Her eyes, wide and shining in the lantern's glow, met his. "You shouldn't risk this," she whispered. "If your father finds out—" Thomas stepped closer, not enough to frighten her, but enough to show sincerity. "You're not doing anything wrong. You're just trying to work, and I don't want you to suffer alone." Eliza swallowed, her voice trembling slightly. "No one's ever said something like that to me before." Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark white. For a heartbeat, Thomas saw her clearly, every contour of her face, every shadow in her eyes, every emotion she tried to hide. He said softly, "Maybe they should have." Silence stretched between them, fragile and electric. Another rumble of thunder broke it, and Eliza looked away. "This is dangerous," she murmured. "You shouldn't be here with me. People talk, and talk spreads fast." "I know," Thomas admitted, "but I find myself here anyway." Eliza looked at him, and this time she didn't look away as quickly. There was something in her gaze, not acceptance, not yet, but a flicker of trust, a tiny, trembling spark. "Good night, Eliza," he whispered. "Good night, sir," she replied, though her voice was barely audible. When Thomas left the room, drenched in storm sounds and racing thoughts, he didn't realize that the line between them had already shifted. He didn't know that this moment, simple, quiet, unplanned, would become the first thread in a dangerous tapestry of emotion. He didn't know that from this night forward his steps would gravitate toward her, even when he tried to avoid it. He didn't know that fate had just opened a door, and neither of them would be able to close it again. In the days after the storm, something unspoken hung in the air between Thomas and Eliza, something delicate, something that hummed beneath the surface of every glance, every breath, every quiet moment they happened to share in the same room. Neither of them acknowledged it directly. To do so would have been to step across a line that society had carved in stone. And yet, the line between them had already begun to blur, like a chalk boundary slowly dissolving under rain. Eliza did everything in her power to avoid him at first, not out of dislike, but out of fear. She knew too well the dangers of kindness offered by a man in Thomas's position. She had seen what could happen to women in the quarters if they were even suspected of inviting attention. Punishment for those assumptions was often swifter and harsher than punishment for proven crimes, The plantation world thrived on whispers, on watchful eyes, on power exercised through fear. Even a harmless smile exchanged in the wrong room could lead to consequences she could not escape, but fate, it seemed, had its own plans. One morning, Thomas sat in the library reviewing the thick binder of accounts his father left for him. Numbers swam before his eyes. He tried to focus, to be the son his father expected, but his thoughts drifted. Every time he pushed back the feeling, his mind slipped toward the memory of Eliza standing in the lantern-lit pantry, soft hair clinging to her face, eyes bright with stormlight, her voice trembling with caution and something else he couldn't name, something he had not been taught to recognize. He rubbed his temples in frustration. He hated himself for thinking about her. He hated how impossible it felt to control. But beneath the frustration was something warm, restless, and new, something that made him feel alive for the first time in years. The library door creaked open. Thomas looked up. Eliza stepped inside with a basket of freshly ironed linens. She paused when she saw him, as though considering whether she had entered the wrong room. He quickly straightened his posture, pretending to return to his work. "You can come in," he said gently. "I'm just reviewing some figures." Eliza nodded, then walked slowly toward the shelves. She moved carefully, making herself small, trying to finish her task as quickly and quietly as possible. Yet Thomas couldn't help watching the delicate movements of her hands as she placed folded cloth on the cabinet shelf. She handled everything with care, as if she believed even simple linens deserved gentleness. The realization struck him. She lived in a world where so little kindness was given to her, yet she offered it freely to the things she touched. "You don't have to hurry," Thomas said before he could stop himself. "Take your time." She froze at the sound of his voice. Slowly she turned toward him, her eyes uncertain. "I don't want to disturb you, sir." "You're not," he replied. For a moment silence stretched between them, soft, fragile. Eliza lowered her gaze again and resumed her work, but her hands trembled slightly now, and Thomas hated himself for being the cause of it. When she finished and headed for the door, Thomas rose from his chair. "Eliza," he called gently. She paused, turning halfway, her fingers gripping the basket handle tightly. "I wanted to apologize for the other night, for being in the pantry with you." He struggled to find the right words. "I didn't mean to frighten you." Her expression softened, though caution still shadowed her eyes. "You didn't frighten me, sir." "Then what is it?" he asked quietly. Eliza hesitated. She looked toward the window as though searching for courage in the sunlight. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You're kind to me, kinder than I'm used to, and kindness from someone in your position can cause trouble." Thomas exhaled slowly. She wasn't wrong. Kindness from a master to a slave was rarely seen as innocent. It was seen as temptation, as impropriety, as danger. "I understand," he said softly. "I'll be careful." Eliza nodded, and for a brief moment she met his eyes fully, openly, before she slipped out the door like a shadow vanishing into daylight. But that small moment of honesty was all it took for something inside Thomas to shift from quiet curiosity to something deeper, something he could no longer deny. He started noticing her even in places he never expected. While walking through the dining hall, he saw her arranging silverware with graceful precision. While inspecting the porch repairs, he saw her hanging linens to dry in the sunlight, the wind catching the delicate strands of her hair. During evening hours, when the corridor was quietly lit by oil lamps, he spotted her carrying folded towels toward the guest rooms, and each time he found himself slowing his steps without meaning to. One afternoon, when the summer heat turned the house into a warm cocoon, Thomas stepped outside to escape the suffocating air. The sun hung low, casting amber light across the fields. As he made his way toward the old oak behind the stables, a place he often went to think, he stopped in his tracks. Eliza was there, not working, not carrying books or baskets, not serving or cleaning, but simply standing beneath the wide, spreading branches. She was alone, staring at the horizon where the sky dipped into the line of distant pines. Her posture was relaxed, her face softened by the golden glow of sunset. For the first time she looked free, not truly but momentarily, in her own quiet way. He didn't want to disturb her, but something drew him forward, step by quiet step. until she turned and noticed him. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Sir, I didn't see you there." "You're not working?" he asked, immediately regretting the question. It sounded accusing, though he didn't mean it that way. Eliza folded her hands. "I finished my tasks early. I was given a few minutes before supper needs to be prepared." "Oh," he said, relieved. "I'm not here to question you." She relaxed slightly. Thomas hesitated, then stepped closer. "Do you come here often?" Eliza nodded. "Sometimes, when I need to breathe." The simplicity of her answer hit him hard. How long had it been since he felt free to breathe? How long had he been living under the weight of expectations too heavy for his shoulders? Maybe they weren't so different after all, not in spirit at least. "May I stay?" he asked gently. Eliza's brows lifted in confusion. "With me? If that's all right." She looked away, thinking it was dangerous. Everything between them was dangerous. But after a long pause she gave a small nod. They stood side by side under the oak tree as warm wind rustled the leaves above them. The silence between them wasn't heavy now. It felt strangely comfortable, like two people sharing a secret without speaking it aloud. Thomas said quietly, "I heard you humming again yesterday." Eliza's eyes widened. "I didn't think anyone was near." "I wasn't near," he admitted, "but I still heard you." She looked embarrassed. "It's a song my mother taught me, from when I was a child." "It's beautiful," he said. She smiled faintly, the smallest, softest smile he had ever seen from her. It was like watching a delicate flower unfold in slow motion. Thomas wanted to ask about her mother, about her past, about the parts of her life she carried silently. But he held back. He didn't want to push her, didn't want to pry open wounds she wasn't ready to reveal. Instead, he said, "You can sing whenever you want, at least around me." Her smile faded into something sad. "It's safer if I don't." He wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. They stood in silence again, watching sunset bleed into dusk. After a long moment, Eliza spoke. "Why are you being like this with me?" The question hung in the air, trembling. Thomas felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He didn't know how to answer. Part of him wanted to deny everything, to pretend he felt nothing, but the truth gnawed at him with stubborn persistence. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe because when I'm around you, I don't feel like the person my father is trying to make me." Eliza blinked as though surprised by his vulnerability. "And what do you feel like instead?" she asked. "Like myself," he murmured. A soft wind passed between them, carrying the scent of summer grass. Eliza inhaled slowly, then whispered, "I don't want to cause you trouble." "You're not," Thomas said. "You could lose everything," she warned. "Your father, your future, your place in this world." Thomas swallowed. "If my place in this world requires me to pretend I don't see you, to pretend I don't feel—" He stopped, because the words scared him. They scared both of them. Eliza looked down, her voice trembling. "You mustn't say things like that." "Why?" "Because I don't know what to do with them," she whispered. "And I cannot afford to hope for things that won't ever be allowed." Her honesty pierced him like a blade made of sorrow and truth. "I won't hurt you," Thomas said softly. "I know," she whispered. "That's what makes this dangerous." For the first time she allowed herself to look directly into his eyes, fully, openly, as if she were searching for the truth buried beneath his words. In that moment, the entire world seemed to pause. The breeze stilled, the birds fell silent, even the fading sunlight seemed to hover between them, reluctant to move on. It was the kind of moment that, had either of them stepped into it fully, would have changed everything. But Eliza stepped back first. "I must go," she whispered, voice trembling. "They'll wonder where I am." Thomas nodded, though disappointment tugged at him like a shadow. "Of course." She turned to leave, but halfway across the yard she paused and looked over her shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing me." Then she walked away, the last rays of sunlight catching the hem of her dress like a whisper of gold. Thomas stood under the oak tree long after she was gone, staring at the path she had taken. His thoughts churned like a storm gathering on the horizon. He knew what was happening. He could feel it in the quickening of his pulse, in the way his breath caught at the sound of her footsteps, in the restless ache that woke him at night. He was falling in love with her, dangerously, irrevocably, silently, and somewhere deep inside him, in a place his father had never been able to reach, He knew that this love, this forbidden, impossible love, would change the course of his life forever. Whether it would save him or destroy them both remained a question he wasn't yet brave enough to face. The days that followed passed in a strange, trembling quiet, as if the entire household sensed that something had shifted, something fragile and dangerous that no one dared name aloud. For Samuel, every step through the merchant's grand home felt like walking across a frozen lake, thin, cracking, and uncertain. He could not shake the memory of Elena's trembling voice the night she confessed her fears, nor the way she had clung to him in the dark, as if the shadows in the corners were listening. He knew she was not wrong. Something in the air had changed. The overseer walked with heavier steps. The merchant's eyes lingered with sharper suspicion, and the servants whispered behind closed doors as though frightened of their own words. But amid all this tension, buried beneath the fear, was the pulse of something stronger. Samuel's love for Elena, a love that now refused to quiet itself. Every morning he found himself drawn to the back corridors where she worked, pretending to need something trivial only to catch a glimpse of her. Sometimes their hands brushed, sometimes their eyes locked, and each time that connection felt more dangerous and more impossible to resist. Elena felt it too. It showed in the way her breath hitched when he entered the room, in the way her fingers lingered on the wooden table as if remembering the warmth of his touch, and in the way she stole glances at him with a mixture of longing and terror. They both knew that the line they were crossing could never be crossed safely, not in 1847, not in a house owned by a man with power over both of their lives. But the heart rarely bows to reason. The merchant, meanwhile, seemed to shift between unusual moods, sometimes quiet and observant, sometimes impatient and irritable. He had noticed Samuel growing more distant, more thoughtful, and more protective in ways that he could not quite explain. Though he said nothing outright, his eyes followed his son with an intensity that made Samuel uneasy. The merchant had built his life on control, of his business, of his household, of every person who lived under his roof, and when control wavered, his temper followed. Samuel understood this better than anyone. He had grown up watching his father calculate everything, profits, alliances, dangers, and now Samuel felt like he was being calculated too. One afternoon that suspicion took physical form. Samuel was crossing the courtyard when he noticed his father standing near the veranda, speaking in low tones with the overseer. The overseer's expression was grim, his shoulders stiff. When they noticed Samuel approaching, their conversation stopped abruptly. Both men stepped aside, but not before Samuel saw it, the cold, assessing way his father's eyes narrowed at him, then shifted toward the workers' quarters where Elena slept. In that instant, Samuel knew something. His father was watching her, and if he was watching her, he was watching them. The thought made Samuel's blood run cold. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling as the hours dragged by, listening to the sounds of the house settling into darkness. Every creak felt like a warning. Every distant footstep felt like a threat. He could not bear the thought of Elena suffering because of him. Eventually, unable to stay still any longer, he slipped out of bed and quietly stepped into the hallway. The house was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. Moving silently, Samuel made his way down the stairs, through the back corridor, and toward the small servants' quarters. When he reached Elena's door, he hesitated only a moment before softly tapping. It opened a second later, and there she stood, eyes tired, expression worried, but still as breathtaking as ever. She didn't speak. She simply stepped aside to let him in. The moment the door closed, Samuel felt the weight of the world press down on him. He sank onto the small wooden stool as Elena knelt in front of him, her hands gently resting on his knees, her thumb brushing across his trembling fingers. He told her everything, how his father had been watching, how the overseer had been questioning, how the silence in the house felt dangerous. Elena listened without blinking, her expression tightening with fear, but she did not pull away. Instead, she rested her forehead against his and whispered that she was not afraid of hardship, only of losing him. Her voice cracked when she said it, and Samuel felt his heart break and mend all at once. They held each other for what felt like an eternity, but the moment was cut short by the faint sound of footsteps outside. Elena's breath froze. Samuel's heartbeat thundered as the footsteps paused near the door. A shadow under the crack of the door shifted, waited, then moved on. It was a close call, too close. Samuel slipped out the back window rather than risk being seen leaving through the door. The cold night air bit his skin, but the fear burning in his chest was worse. He returned to his room shaken, knowing the walls around them were shrinking, closing in. The next morning a storm rolled across the horizon, thick clouds carrying the promise of heavy rain. The atmosphere inside the house seemed to mimic the weather, dark, heavy, and full of tension. The merchant's temper was sharper than usual. He snapped at servants, corrected Samuel for the smallest mistakes, and carried an expression that looked like he was waiting for something, like he expected a truth to reveal itself. Samuel tried to remain calm, but inside he was unraveling. The fear of discovery battled with the desperate, consuming need to protect Elena. That afternoon the storm finally broke. Rain hammered the roof, wind rattled the shutters, and the quiet of the house was swallowed by the roar of nature. Most of the staff hurried to secure the windows and bring supplies indoors. During that chaos, Samuel slipped away to the storage barn behind the main house, a place he and Elena had used only once before, months ago, when their feelings had first begun to bloom. He waited there, half hoping and half dreading that she would come, and she did. The moment she entered, soaked from the rain and shivering, he rushed to her, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. The storm outside made the small wooden barn feel like a world of its own, sealed from time and consequence. But their brief moment of safety shattered when the barn door suddenly creaked. Samuel froze. Elena's hand tightened around his sleeve. The merchant stepped inside, his silhouette sharp against the grey rainlight behind him. His expression was unreadable at first, almost calm, but his eyes told another story. They were cold, furious, and wounded all at once. Samuel felt the ground drop beneath him. Elena's breath caught, and Samuel instinctively stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body. The merchant said nothing at first. He simply stared, taking in the sight, the two of them together, alone, in the middle of a storm. And that silence, thick and suffocating, was far more terrifying than if he had shouted. Finally he spoke Samuel's name, low and Saint Edie, a voice filled with disbelief and betrayal. Samuel tried to explain. He tried to speak of love, of choice, of humanity, but his father's expression only hardened. When the merchant's eyes shifted to Elena, she lowered her gaze, fear trembling through her frame. The storm outside howled louder, as if echoing the rising tension in the barn. The merchant stepped forward, and Samuel instinctively blocked him. For the first time in his life, he stood defiant against the man who raised him. It drew a look of shock from his father, quickly replaced by a rage that made Samuel's stomach twist. Words were exchanged, heated, desperate, intense. Samuel told his father he would not abandon Elena. The merchant told him he was throwing away his future, his inheritance, his reputation. Samuel insisted that none of those things mattered if he had to live in a world where Elena suffered. The argument escalated, echoing through the wooden walls, until finally the merchant's voice dropped to a chilling calm. He said something that turned Samuel's blood to ice, something that made Elena gasp and stumble back. Whatever the exact words were, they carried a message clear as lightning. Elena's place in the household would change forever, and not for the better. That was the moment Samuel realized the truth. If he didn't stand against his father now, he would lose Elena. Not just their love, but her very life. The storm raged harder. The merchant turned to leave, his final command echoing in the barn, an order Samuel could not allow to become reality. The moment the merchant stepped into the rain, Samuel knew their lives had changed forever. He grabbed Elena's hand, pulling her close, and whispered that they had no choice now. If they stayed, his father would destroy them. If they left, the world outside would not be kind, but at least they would face it together. And as the rain poured down in violent sheets, Samuel and Elena prepared to make a choice that would rip open the quiet world of 1847 and set into motion a chain of events neither of them could escape. Thomas had never felt night air so sharp, so alive, so heavy with consequence, as the moment he slipped the metal latch on his bedroom window and lowered himself carefully onto the slanted roof. The house behind him was silent except for the distant murmur of guards patrolling the grounds. Lantern light drifted faintly through cracks in the shutters, but the rest of the plantation lay blanketed in darkness, a darkness he prayed would hide him long enough to change both their destinies. His heart pounded so violently he feared it might give him away before he even reached the ground. Every thought in his mind screamed the same truth. If he was caught tonight, he would never be heard from again, and if Eliza was caught, her fate would be far worse. He lowered himself until his boots hung off the roof's edge and let G. The soft thud of his landing disappeared into the damp grass. For a moment he remained crouched, eyes locked on the shadows, listening for any sign he had been discovered. Nothing, only the rustle of branches shifting in the breeze. The night felt like it was holding its breath for him. Still bent low, Thomas moved along the side of the house, keeping close to the wall where the lanterns didn't reach. Each footstep was deliberate and silent, though inside, panic and determination wrestled violently. When he reached the cellar door, he pressed his ear against the wood. Silence. Carefully he lifted the iron latch and froze. Footsteps, slow, dragging footsteps, but they were far off, drifting from the opposite side of the house. He waited until they faded before pulling the door fully open and slipping inside. The cellar smelled of earth, old wood, and damp iron. A single lantern flickered on a hook, casting weak light over the crude storage room, and in the corner, chained to a wooden support beam, was Eliza. The moment her eyes found him, tears gathered but did not fall. She shook her head urgently, silently pleading for him to leave, to save himself. But Thomas knelt beside her and cupped her face in his trembling hands, his voice barely a whisper as he vowed he would not leave her to Charles's punishment, no matter the cost. Her wrists were raw from the restraints, her breathing uneven from fear and exhaustion, yet when he said her name, something fierce and bright awakened in her eyes. She leaned into his touch, trusting him with a courage he wished he had possessed sooner. His hands shook as he removed the ring of keys he had stolen from the overseer's belt earlier that day. Each key scraped against the metal lock until finally one clicked. The cuff fell open, then the next. Eliza inhaled sharply as her arms came free, wincing at the sting, but Thomas quickly took her hands and rubbed life back into them. She whispered his name with such fragile relief that he nearly broke apart then and there. But there was no time. Not tonight. He wrapped a cloak around her shoulders, pulled the lantern off its hook, and led her toward the steps. The cellar door creaked painfully as they pushed it open. The wind outside was colder than before, carrying the smell of river water and the distant storm forming somewhere beyond the tree line. He paused long enough to scan the dark fields. No torches, no shouts, no one yet aware that he was no longer locked in his room and that she was no longer a prisoner in his father's cellar. They slipped into the shadows, moving quickly toward the edge of the property. Eliza stumbled twice, her legs stiff from hours in the cellar, but Thomas steadied her each time, whispering encouragement, whispering love, whispering hope. He barely believed in himself. The world felt too quiet, too tense, as if something unseen stalked them through the trees. The moonlight barely reached the ground, but Thomas navigated with memory and instinct, guiding her through the path he had planned the moment he resolved to free her. The forest loomed ahead, a dark mass that offered both danger and sanctuary. Beyond those trees lay the river, and at the river waited the small trading boat whose captain owed Thomas a favor he never thought he'd call upon. If they reached it by sunrise, they would have a chance, not a guarantee, not a promise, but a chance to disappear into the world as two free people bound by love, not by chains. But every step toward that river felt like a step onto thin ice. As they approached the tree line, Eliza paused, clutching his arm. She turned back toward the sprawling house just visible through the darkness. Her eyes were wide with fear, not for herself, but for him. She would see in darkness. In daylight, a pair on foot would be visible from far away. They had minutes at best. The river finally revealed itself through the trees, wide and glittering with the promise of escape. The small trading boat was docked near the bend, swaying gently in the water. Thomas felt a fragile hope swell inside him. They were close, too close to turn back, too close to lose everything now. But just as they broke through the final line of trees, Eliza froze. Thomas followed her gaze. On the opposite ridge, near the crest of the hill, torches reappeared, more than before, moving toward the river, fast. His father had realized the mistake. They were cutting them off from the banks. Eliza took a step back, panic threatening to break her. Thomas grabbed her face, pressing his forehead to hers once more, whispering that they had no choice but to run as if the world itself was falling apart behind them. And so they ran, down the slope through the last barrier of brush, toward the thin wooden dock that separated them from the water and freedom. But the shouts came almost immediately, harsh, furious, echoing through the forest with chilling clarity. "Thomas!" Eliza flinched. Thomas did not look back. If he did, he feared his courage would shatter. They reached the dock just as a figure on the hill lit a brighter torch, illuminating their silhouettes. The boat's captain, awakened by the commotion, shouted for them to hurry. Thomas lifted Eliza into the boat, the wood rocking violently beneath her as she fell into the captain's arms. But the moment Thomas placed one foot on the dock to board, a gunshot ripped through the air, shattering the stillness of dawn. Eliza screamed his name. Whether the bullet struck him, whether he jumped into the boat, whether he fell into the river, whether they sailed away together into the rising sun, or whether the chase ended in blood, the truth was swallowed by the river's mist. Some say the lovers vanished into the current and survived under new names. Others whisper that Charles's shot found its mark, and some claim they both died that morning, holding on to each other until their last breath. No record confirms what happened. No grave marks their fate, just a story, retold in hushed voices across the South, of a love so desperate and defiant that it challenged the world around it, a love that became a legend not because it ended happily, but because it refused to bow to fear, but because it refused